Yeah, you're fine.
Excellent. All right, here is, I'm pulling up my second task. Ha, I'm talking about tasks. My second presentation. All right, there, we should be able to see my slides. I will go ahead and get going. All right, so I talked about Prop 3, and now I'm going to talk about how this might interact with neuroscience theory. So talked about how you can use the problem space computational model and how this involves time to switch problem spaces and you get good results. But is this valid? Modeling human cognition, you want to model what's actually going on in human cognition. It's all very well and good to say, hey, the results look like what humans do, but there are many ways of potentially getting those kinds of results. Does the actual computation that your model is doing reflect what we think is actually going on in human brains? So this talk I'm going to be talking about, well, yes, actually. Soar PSCM theory, as I use it in Prop 3, also looks very similar to task set theory from neuroscience. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And how seeing this connection between the two might offer new avenues of future research. So, but what are task sets? What is task set theory? Why is it here? What is its purpose in life? So task sets, I'm going to demonstrate or describe what task sets are by way of a participation example. So all of you across the internet, you can do this from the luxury of your computers. I will trust that you'll play along. So I have this box on the right of the screen. If you see an odd number in the box, then raise your left hand. If you see an even number in the box, then raise your right hand. So I'll show the first number, 2. You can raise one of your hands now. The number goes away. All right. And another number, 6. You can raise another one of your hands. Peter is playing along and showing us answers. And now here's another number, 41. That's our last number. So hopefully you all raised your right hand a couple times and then your left hand. But now, how did you do that? So task sets are a theoretical construct describing the neural activity that you use to understand the instructions that I gave you about this task and then to play along with it. Your neural encoding of those 2 rules that I gave you. The first rule being with the odd number, the second rule about what to do with an even number. So task sets are a short-term working memory guide for procedures in your prefrontal cortex. You can measure this as activity pattern that you see in your prefrontal cortex that's sustained from the time that I tell you what the rules are, and then while you're waiting for the task, and then when you actually perform the task. These task sets are often described as rule-based condition action. It's another way of describing stimulus-response mappings. Task sets are also observed to have a rostrocaudal gradient in the brain, which means that from front to back, the more sensory-based rules that we represent seem to be have the activity towards the back, and the more cognitive abstract rules seem to have their activity towards the front. And there seems to be this kind of hierarchical gradient, which is fascinating. You can see already where I might be going with this. And task sets are also thought to be a significant factor in explaining how long it takes for us to do the things that we do when we're switching tasks. It takes time to change whichever set of neurons are active. In this figure, there is an example where the pink line, or the first line on the left, shows when a subject is told which tasks they're about to need to perform, and then the line on the right shows when they actually receive the prompt. So on the left line would be me telling you when you see a number, when you see an even number, raise your right hand, and then the black line shows me actually showing you the number. And it takes time to adapt to the prompt of what it is you're supposed to do. If you make the time between the prompt and the actual showing of the number, the trial, short, then it takes you longer to actually respond because it takes you time to prepare for giving that response. But there's also research that shows that having a limited active number of responses in your set, the requirement to have to switch task sets rather than having all your behaviors available at once. This is shielding decision-making from irrelevant stimuli and irrelevant responses. So there's a trade-off between being able to react immediately and having easier decision-making. So these three functions that I want us to highlight, that task sets, decision-making is based on the current task set, which is a set of mappings relevant to the current context, that they have a hierarchical representation in the prefrontal cortex, and that they serve a purpose of shielding decision-making from irrelevant rule knowledge. It only looks at what is in the current set. And now look back at Soar problem space computational model theory, which I described before. You have this same hierarchy of problem spaces of goals and subgoals, and these problem spaces shield decision-making from irrelevant proposals and elaborations. You're only going to have an agent propose find prompt if it's in the correct problem space, if the goal is get text. They serve this same function, but computationally. And we can see they have these same three properties. A problem space describes a set of operators that are relevant to the current context. They are hierarchically represented with goals as subgoals, and they serve the function of shielding decision-making from irrelevant operators, irrelevant rule knowledge. So noticing this is a cool line of thought. Where can we go with this? Well, also looking at what I talked about with Prop 3, with procedure context as a literal representation of the problem space pulled into working memory, that sounds an awful lot like a task set as a working memory structure. It's a set of operators which are stimulus response mappings of, given this proposal condition, then do this apply action. And it takes time to retrieve these into working memory. Like I talked before about the timing method of 50 milliseconds a decision cycle, and 150 milliseconds total to do one of these changes. This sounds pretty similar to what's described as needing time to switch from one task to another. So this also is a plausible way of looking at task sets. And as was shown in the previous talk, this method of timing does work in practice for modeling human behavior in tasks. Is the flat 150 milliseconds oversimplistic? Maybe, probably, hard to say, because it does work with these tasks. That's an avenue for future research. But what we can say is that the principle behind using a single mechanic for all tasks is a nice task general principle, which is also a valid ideal one for modeling how does the general human brain work. So takeaways. We have Soar problem spaces that mirror task sets, and this indicates that this kind of model for human cognition is theoretically plausible. Doesn't mean it's a perfect or accurate model, but at least it checks out that we're not just making something up that gives us the right results. And Soar provides an actual computational model for what at this point has been described mostly in theoretical terms. There are other computational models of task sets out there, but not many, and none that I'm aware of with cognitive architecture specifically. So this provides a connection between Soar and neuroscience that can be a basis for a lot of cool future exploration possibly. Seeing the ways that neuroscience research is related to task sets, we can see if that's related to Soar models. One example of this, a dominant theory about task sets from Oberauer, is that a task set is one of two main structures in working memory. The task set corresponds to what he calls a procedural working memory, the part of working memory that configures your use of procedures. The other is what he calls a memory set, which is the declarative side of working memory, which is another structure that's similar to a task set, which configures your use of declarative facts. But he describes how both of these structures are thought to have a similar representation in the prefrontal cortex. So might this be an avenue for future research in Soar? Might you be able to use the same sort of declarative structure that I use with procedure context for task sets? Can you also use those to mediate your access of declarative knowledge and more like facts in long-term memory, like the apple is red? And do you have to navigate a certain hierarchy of structures in your long-term memory in order to access these facts? These are open questions that require future work, but they are things that I am excited to look into, and which I wanted to share with you all today. So summary, we have the Soar problem space computational model looking very similar to task set principles, which make this approach a plausible model of cognition in my mind. Procedure context of the Prop 3 model, which I talked about earlier, serve to unify these theories by providing an explicit declarative structure that corresponds to a task set in Soar working memory. And this work suggests future work with looking into declarative memory sets. Cole, kind of a question mark on this one, because this is a big space of new questions and a lot more to research. You could see that as a cool thing, as a positive too, but that is the state of where my research is going right now. So thank you all. This is the end of my talk. I'm open for questions. I have some time, it looks like.
Thanks, Brian. In the chat, it isn't actually a question. There's a link for you to maybe check out later. I haven't looked at it, but it might be helpful.
Oh, thanks, Paul.
All right, I'll wait just a moment. Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions right now. We are a little ahead of schedule. So we will take a short break and the next talk will begin at 1:50.
Make sure that everything works well during the break.
Yeah, James, feel free to test it out, make sure it's all good.
Slideshow. That is what I wanted to do. Can everyone see this?
Yeah,
That's visible.
your volume's a little low.
Is this better?
Slightly. All right, it's about that time. James Boggs, please, whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephen. So I will be presenting on research directions that I'm going to be pursuing in the future on adding non-symbolic memory elements to Soar. I'm James Boggs. I'm from the University of Michigan, a PhD student in John's lab. And please, yep, there you go. So some background, we've gone over a lot of this. But Soar is a cognitive architecture. It tries to emulate cognition. And in particular, it has memory components on which procedural memory operates. There's working memory, there's semantic and episodic memory. These are kind of the long-term memories that store knowledge, which you can use in the real world. And these are like, rules that affect working memory. But all of these things are purely symbolic and abstract. There's no spatial or visual or motor sensing or anything like that included here. It's all just arbitrary symbols which tie together via relationships. So the exception is SVS. So the spatial visual system came into being like a while ago and has gone through a number of transformations. Currently what it is just a scene graph. So it lets the Soar agent keep track of the scene, presumably either the real world or a simulated world or something like that, via a graph of entities in that world and spatial relationships between them, which we call transforms. So you can see here, for example, there's a world and then there's a car, and then the wheels are defined by the position from the origin of the car, which is defined in space by its transform from the origin of the world. So these are spatial transforms, not prepositions like above or on or next to, which does bring it a little bit closer to reality and to being grounded in useful things, but it's still very much an abstract thing. And importantly, it doesn't interact with the outside world by itself. It just simply gets fed in knowledge about what the world or the scene graph should be. So what's missing? Several different things. Perception, a spatial visual system, you would expect to be able to have vision. And right now, SVS does not include anything visual, neither input nor like image processing. Similarly, like audition and tactile feedback are things that like might be useful percepts for an embodied robot, which SVS doesn't handle at all. Then there's memory. So you want to be able to remember scenes. As it stands in SVS, you cannot remember scenes once you've changed the scene graph a little bit. Like the previous scene graph is more or less gone, or at least you have to remember what changes you made so that you can undo them. It should also remember like visual aspects, like what objects look like, and maybe motor trajectories, like how to move the arm in a certain way. And then there's also motion, like controlling the motor elements of the robot. But I'm not going to touch on that. Lizzie will be following this talk with an excellent talk about adding motion to SVS and to Soar. So this is kind of the plan, or a proposed plan. There's a number of different ideas floating around in the Soar lab right now. So this is absolutely not final. It's just sort of a proposal that I'm presenting. But I know John has a slightly different visual for his white paper. So there are 5 elements. The scene graph is the only element that's the same as the original SVS. It encompasses essentially all of what SVS is now. And then it has, a long-term memory, some perception elements over here, and then an additional aid for memory reconstruction. So I'll just go through these one by one and kind of outline what I'm thinking. So the scene graph, as I just mentioned, it's mostly just what SVS is. It has objects or entities as nodes, spatial relationships as edges. We may or may not want to include like certain kinds of like information tags on nodes and such. But also importantly, it should be able to talk with a variety of different other SVS elements. So the long-term memory, obviously, it should be able to be storing and retrieving things from long-term memory. And it should be being informed by percept comprehension, like what it's seeing from the sensors, which would be like additions to SVS as it stands. The scene long-term memory is the most general form of long-term memory here, in the sense that it encompasses a lot of the different scene things. It's linked to episodic memory. So you can remember what you've seen in the past. Scene is being an overloaded word here. And the general idea is that you want to store both full complex scene graphs as well as partial scene graph snippets in a way that you can recall based on either triggers, like what's in working memory or scene graph state, or just like requests, like, oh, I want to know the last time that the car was, like parked in the garage. So like car in garage might be something that you want to be able to remember like the whole scene that was happening at that time. Naturally, again, it's connected to episodic memory, or hopefully will be, via perhaps pointers between the two, in the sense that if you have, an episode in your long-term memory, it would be helpful to also be able to recall what the state of the world was like during that episode. Percept comprehension is, a working name for the basic idea of taking in sensory data and then doing all kinds of manipulations with it. First and foremost, kind of wants to work with scene graph to come up with what the scene graph really is based on sensors, and map sensor data to scene graph elements. But it also can work with imagination. So like if you say, as in John's example, imagine the word wow and then turn it upside down, that would be the role that percept comprehension plays. And then obviously percept comprehension would store certain percepts in a long-term memory. And the way that I'm envisioning this, at least, is visual archetypes tied to objects or entities or concepts. So rather than like storing just a huge sequence of images, you would have like the idea of what a ball looks like, the idea of what like a cube looks like, the idea of what like a Lego brick looks like, which you can link back and forth to from semantic memory, and which can be used to inform percept comprehension of like what it might be seeing from the sensors. And these would either be like stored ahead of time or like learned via percept comprehension, along with the scene graph being able to isolate what a particular part of the percept, for example, an image might correspond to as an entity. And then finally, there's memory reconstruction. So the idea here is that neither scene graph long-term memory nor percept long-term memory stores the actual images of what a scene looked like in the past, what your memory was. So if you recall a memory, you can like recall an image of it as a human, and neither of these things have that particular image. The idea is by combining the scene that's remembered at that time with a percept, with knowledge of what the entities look like from Percept long-term memory, you can reconstruct the image of the scene and the scene graph as it was formed from Percept comprehension rather than just purely from memory. And this can also be informed by different parts of working memory, which would allow you to like give it hints, basically say like, oh, well, remember that the cat was actually like an orange cat at that time. And that's pretty much the outline of where I'm hoping to go with all of this. Nuggets, there's a lot of potential directions here and a lot of good research in the future. And also I think it adds a lot of utility to Soar, both as a tool for AI-driven like robots, but also as maybe a model for human behavior in some sense. Like a lot of the things that humans do with regards to grounding percepts don't happen in Soar right now. And Cole, obviously there's quite a lot still to be ironed out. There's going to be a lot of additional code which will be needed for all of the SVS modules, which I would be proposing. And also, like, obviously the research challenges themselves are quite difficult. So that is my slide. It looks like we have a couple minutes for questions. Or my slide deck.
So I'm confused a little bit. I thought John said we could imagine wow, turn it upside down, and realize that's the word mom.
So you can, as long as you have an outside interface which does vision. As far as I know, there's not a way to do that within Soar right now. But using actions on the output link and the input link, you can have, for example, like a PyTorch or something like that, you know, MNIST recognizer, be able to take an image, like just use a flipped rotation operation and then like recognize each letter and then pass it back to Soar. Like these are the letters in the word. John, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there's
That's correct. That was supposed to be, yes, that was my example was supposed to just try to illustrate what could go on, and definitely it did not. We do not yet have those capabilities to do the recognition of something like mom after wow was turned upside down. So yeah, your description is correct.
All right.
All right, well, thank you.